Something happened on Korriban that no one in the Republic noticed. No alarm was raised. No Jedi felt a disturbance. A handful of exiles stepped off their ships onto red sand, looked at a world they had never seen, and decided it would do. That was the beginning. What they built there became the most dangerous institution in the history of the galaxy. Not an army, not a superweapon, a school. And what they taught inside it would shape the next 7,000 years in ways that almost no one saw coming and almost no one survived understanding. Think about that for a moment. 7,000 years. Academy after academy, world after world, master after master, standing in front of a student and deciding how much darkness to hand over. Some of those students became the most powerful beings their era had ever seen. Some of them killed their teachers on the way out. Some of them burned entire civilizations to the ground with what they had been given. And through all of it, through every war and every collapse and every desperate attempt to rebuild what the last disaster had destroyed, the knowledge kept moving, kept finding new hands to hold it, kept producing something the galaxy could not ignore and could not fully stop. This is the story of every Sith Academy that ever existed. Every institution the dark side built to pass itself on. Every hall carved from black stone, where the question was never what you could learn, but whether you would survive learning it. The teachers who did not always outlast their own students, the students who became exactly what they were taught to become, which was sometimes what their masters intended, and sometimes something far more dangerous than that. The traditions so deeply embedded in Sith culture that they survived the death of the empires that created them, continuing quietly in ruins and in hiding until someone new arrived to rebuild them once more. It begins, as so many Sith stories do, with exile. Around 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Jedi Order faced one of the most severe internal crises in its long history. A faction within its ranks had gone somewhere the rest of the Order refused to follow. These were not merely dissatisfied students or impatient knights who chafed under the pace of their training or the emphasis on meditation and serenity that the Jedi philosophy required. They were Force users who had turned toward the dark side with genuine conviction, who had found in its depths a kind of power and a kind of truth the Jedi philosophy not only denied, but actively refused to investigate. They explored Sith alchemy, experiments that twisted living things into shapes nature had never intended and could not sustain without dark side energy continuously applied. They developed rituals that the Jedi Council viewed not merely as dangerous but as corruptions of everything the Force was meant to represent. They built arguments for the dark side that were coherent and internally consistent, and all the more threatening for it. Because an enemy who can argue their case is always more dangerous than one who cannot. The conflict that resulted stretched across 100 years of warfare, known as the 100-Year Darkness. And when it finally ended at the Battle of Korbos, the Jedi and the Republic chose a response that would echo through the next several millennia of galactic history. They chose mercy, or what they believed was mercy. The Dark Jedi were stripped of their weapons and their possessions and loaded onto unarmed vessels and launched beyond the borders of Republic space. The expectation was clear. Without weapons, without resources, without the infrastructure of the worlds they had tried to claim, the exiled faction would wander until they perished or scattered into irrelevance. The Republic dusted its hands and went back to its business. It was one of the most consequential miscalculations in the history of the galaxy, and it was made by people who genuinely believed they were being kind. The ships drifted for weeks. The people inside them were not comfortable. and they were not safe. But they were still among the most powerful Force users in existence, and they had time to think about what came next. When those ships finally found Korriban, a remote and ancient world sitting at the edge of explored space, the exiles did not see disaster. They saw possibility. Korriban was inhabited. Its people, a red-skinned species who would eventually lend their name to everything these exiles built, had developed their own civilization on that harsh world. Their own traditions, their own relationship with the dark side of the Force that they called magic, and worshipped in ways that were crude by Jedi-trained standards, but ran deeper than almost anything the exiles had encountered before. The Sith species had a natural attunement to the dark side that was not trained or chosen but inherent, something that lived in their blood and bones and expressed itself in every ritual and every tradition their civilization had produced over centuries of isolation from the rest of the galaxy. The exiles looked at all of this and understood immediately what it meant. And the first thing they did, before any thought of formal education, before any consideration of how to organize and transmit their knowledge to a new generation, was demonstrate their power in terms so overwhelming that the native Sith people had no framework for understanding what they were seeing, except the one they already had. These newcomers must be gods. There was no other explanation for what they could do, for the fire they could summon from nothing, and the minds they could reach into, and the creatures they could reshape with their touch. And the exiles did not correct this misunderstanding. They amplified it deliberately. They positioned themselves as divine beings who had descended from the stars, and the Sith people, believing what their own eyes told them, accepted this, submitted to it, built their worship around it. This was the original Sith classroom. Before there were buildings, before there were curricula, before there were titles or ranks or formal methods of instruction, there was this fundamental dynamic, the powerful standing over the awed, the knowledgeable looking down at those who desperately wanted to understand. The first lesson the Sith academies ever taught was transmitted in that moment on Korriban, not through words or texts, but through pure demonstration of what the dark side could accomplish in the hands of someone willing to use it without the restraints the Jedi had always insisted were necessary. Power is everything. Demonstration is the only argument that matters. Submission is the price of knowledge. These were not principles that anyone wrote down in those early days. They did not need to be written down. They were lived, enacted in every interaction between the exiles and the native Sith, between master and student, before either word had been applied to either role. Among the exiles, one figure rose above the others with a decisiveness that foreclosed argument. Ajunta Pall had been among the most formidable of the fallen Jedi, a warrior of extraordinary strength and towering ambition who had embraced the dark side with a totality that his former masters had found disturbing even before the war began. On Korriban, Paul declared himself the first Dark Lord of the Sith. He established the hierarchy that would define Sith civilization for the entirety of its existence. At the top, one ruler whose power was absolute and whose word could end your life. Beneath him, the other exiles and the most gifted of the native Sith, designated as Sith Lords and given territories and responsibilities and the carefully managed freedom to pursue their own ambitions, so long as those ambitions did not rise to threatening the Dark Lord directly. Below them, apprentices and students, and at the very base, the ordinary people of what was becoming the Sith Empire. But within that hierarchy, Paul made a decision whose implications would ripple forward through thousands of years of Sith history. He decided that the dark side knowledge the exiles had brought from Republic space would be taught, not hoarded at the top, not kept as the exclusive property of a small elite who would use the ignorance of those beneath them as a weapon of control, but genuinely transmitted to those who demonstrated they were capable of receiving it. Paul's reasoning was practical rather than idealistic. He had arrived on Korriban with a relatively small group of exiles and faced a planet whose native inhabitants, while awed by his power, outnumbered his followers considerably. He needed allies who were genuinely capable, not just loyal servants whose usefulness ended when any significant threat arrived, but Force-sensitive students who could grow strong enough to defend the nascent Sith Order against external dangers while remaining subordinate enough that they did not immediately become internal dangers themselves. This tension between needing students who were powerful and needing students who were controllable would define Sith education for the entirety of its existence across thousands of years and dozens of institutional forms. Every Sith academy that was ever built was trying simultaneously to produce warriors of genuine strength and to prevent those warriors from becoming too strong at the wrong moment. This contradiction was never fully resolved. It was the engine that drove everything. The methods Paul and the other exiles used in those earliest years bore little resemblance to what later generations would formalize as Sith Academy education. There were no structured lessons, no written curricula, no patient masters waiting in designated spaces to answer questions and guide students through a sequence of carefully planned exercises. Learning happened through proximity and observation and trial, in circumstances where failure was lethal. You watched a master perform an act of Sith alchemy, and then you attempted to replicate it under conditions that were not designed to be forgiving. And if you failed catastrophically, you died. And if you succeeded partially, you survived long enough to try again. And if you succeeded completely, your master took note of you with an expression that contained admiration and apprehension in roughly equal measure. You learned the philosophy of the Sith not by reading about it, but by living inside a culture that organized itself entirely around its principles, so that every social interaction, every moment of advancement or humiliation or violence, was itself a lesson in what the dark side believed about the nature of power and the nature of the world. The native Sith people were not passive recipients in this process, and that is something that the histories written by the Republic after the fact tend to understate. They brought to the developing tradition something the exiles could not have manufactured: roots. The Sith species had been communing with the dark side for centuries before the first exile ship broke through the clouds above Korriban, and their accumulated knowledge, their rituals and their sorceries and their ways of understanding the Force as something that breathed through all living things with an emphasis on darkness rather than balance, represented a depth that pure Jedi-trained technique could not replicate. The fusion that began in those first years, human dark Jedi expertise, combining with Sith species tradition, produced something neither group could have created independently. Over generations, as the two populations intermarried and their bloodlines blended, that fusion became inseparable. You could no longer point to a specific teaching and say with confidence that this came from the exiles and that came from the natives. It had all become the same thing, a tradition that carried both inheritances without distinguishing between them, and was stronger for it. What the earliest Sith training produced in those first generations on Korriban were students of a very particular kind. They were not merely skilled, they were convinced. They had been shaped, from childhood in many cases, by an environment that treated power as the only legitimate moral principle, that interpreted compassion as a form of weakness rather than a virtue, that offered genuine rewards to those who embraced its values and demonstrated them through action. The first graduates of the Sith tradition were not people who had been coerced into following darkness. They were people who had been educated into understanding darkness as the true nature of the galaxy, with everything the Jedi represented being the comfortable story that weaker minds told themselves to avoid confronting what was real. This made them extraordinarily dangerous. Not because they were cruel without reason, but because they were absolutely certain that what they were doing was correct. The centuries that followed the establishment of the Sith Order on Korriban saw the civilization that Ajunta Pall had founded expand outward with a confidence that came from genuine power rather than from mere aggression. The Sith Empire grew. New worlds came under its influence. The technology of dark side practice deepened and diversified as each generation built on what the previous one had developed, adding new techniques and new applications and new philosophical refinements to an ever-growing body of knowledge. And as the empire grew and the knowledge accumulated, the question of how to transmit that knowledge to new generations became more pressing and more complex. The informal methods of the earliest years, proximity and observation and lethal trial, were adequate when the Sith Order consisted of a few dozen exiles and their immediate students. They were not adequate for an empire that stretched across multiple star systems and needed to consistently produce force-trained individuals of high quality. The answer, developed gradually over the course of several centuries, was formalization. The Sith began to build institutions, not just temples, which they had always constructed as expressions of dark side power and as sites for ritual practice, but actual schools in the meaningful sense of the word. Physical spaces dedicated to the systematic transmission of Sith knowledge from one generation to the next, with defined structures and defined expectations and defined consequences for failing to meet those expectations. These were the earliest Sith academies in the formal sense. And what makes them worth studying is not simply their brutality, which was real and significant, but their comprehensiveness. The Sith were trying to build something that would last, that would survive the deaths of individual masters and the upheavals of individual conflicts, and continue transmitting the tradition indefinitely. They were, in other words, doing exactly what every serious civilization does when it wants to ensure its own continuity: building schools. Korriban remained the spiritual and educational center of the Sith Empire throughout this period. The world's significance was layered in ways that made it uniquely suited to the purpose. It was the original home of the Sith species, so it carried the weight of authentic tradition rather than being merely a convenient location. It was already dotted with temples built by the earliest Dark Lords. So it had the physical infrastructure of dark side practice embedded in its landscape. And increasingly, as the powerful Sith who had shaped the early centuries of the Empire began to die, it was where they were buried. The tombs of the Dark Lords became a defining feature of Korriban's geography, enormous structures carved deep into the red rock of the world's most famous valley, each one housing the remains and the possessions and often the still active presence of the most powerful Sith who had ever lived. This decision to bury the great Sith on Korriban rather than on their home worlds or the worlds they had conquered was not merely ceremonial, it was pedagogical in the deepest sense of that word. The Sith believed that death did not necessarily end a Force user's relationship with the living, particularly if that Force user had been powerful enough in the dark side to maintain some form of presence in the physical world after the body failed. The ancient Sith were fascinated by this possibility and spent considerable intellectual energy exploring it. The tombs of Korriban were not just monuments to the past, they were repositories of active dark side energy, places where the accumulated power of centuries of Sith practice had saturated the very stone and air, where a student sensitive enough and brave enough might encounter something far more than a historical artifact. You could go into those tombs and feel the weight of everything that had been done there, and in some cases you could encounter something that had once been a Sith Lord and that had refused to fully release its grip on the world of the living. Learning to navigate that, to exist in the presence of entities that were simultaneously sources of immense knowledge and sources of immediate lethal danger, was itself an education that no classroom could fully replicate. The dead of Korriban were not always silent, and the students who spent time near their tombs knew this from direct experience rather than from anything a teacher had told them. The most significant figure in the formalization of Sith education during this period was Marka Ragnos, whose reign as Dark Lord lasted for over a century and is remembered as the golden age of the Sith. Ragnos was a remarkable individual by almost any measure. His power in combat was sufficient to make any individual challenger think very carefully before issuing one. His command of the dark side deep enough that those who seemed his equals in informal demonstration found themselves clearly outmatched when the confrontation became direct and serious. But his true genius was not for fighting. It was for politics, for understanding the complex web of ambition and fear and loyalty that held the Sith Empire together, and for devising systems that could maintain that web, even as the individuals within it constantly shifted their positions and their relative power. Ragnos understood that the most dangerous thing for any Sith ruler was not external enemies. It was the internal competition among powerful subordinates that the Sith philosophy actively encouraged. His solution was characteristically elegant. He channeled that competition into structured forms that produced useful results, that strengthened the empire rather than consuming it from within. Under Ragnos, Sith education became something that could be described as a system rather than merely a tradition. The academies that existed on Korriban and the other major Sith worlds developed clearer curricula, more precisely defined hierarchies of instructors and students, more explicit standards for advancement and for the kind of removal from the program that was sometimes fatal and sometimes merely permanent. Students who showed promise were identified early and given access to resources that others were not offered. Students who showed exceptional promise were placed under the direct instruction of Sith Lords whose expertise matched their potential, creating mentorship relationships that were intensely productive and that lasted exactly as long as the power dynamic between master and student remained stable, which in the Sith tradition meant that they lasted until either the master decided the student had learned enough or the student decided that the master had nothing left to teach them, with very different likely outcomes, depending on which of those two conclusions arrived first. The architecture of the academies reflected their values with a literalness that left no room for misinterpretation. Ragnos had always understood that the physical environment where teaching took place was itself a form of teaching, that what you surrounded your students with told them something essential about what you expected them to become and what you expected them to endure. The academy structures built or expanded during his reign were designed to be imposing in ways that went beyond mere scale. The corridors were deliberately proportioned to create a sense of surveillance and exposure, so that you were never certain whether you were being observed and never comfortable behaving as though you were not. The training chambers were positioned to channel and amplify the dark side energy that saturated Korriban's surface, so that practitioners working within them were always immersed in a level of force presence that would be overwhelming on most other worlds. The libraries, where the accumulated texts and holocrons of generations of Sith Masters were stored, were accessible only to those who had proven themselves through tests that always involved some element of genuine personal danger, never the purely symbolic performances that some educational traditions used as substitutes for real assessment. The teachers who staffed the academies during this golden age were themselves products of the system they taught within. Sith Lords who had survived the competitive brutality of their own education and emerged from it both highly skilled and thoroughly committed to the values that had produced them. What they transmitted to their students was not simply technique, though the technical education was comprehensive and rigorous and covered everything from lightsaber combat forms to force abilities to Sith alchemy to the history of the dark side tradition. They transmitted a worldview, a way of understanding the Force and the galaxy, and the self that was as coherent and internally consistent as anything the Jedi Order had ever developed, even if its conclusions were diametrically opposed to Jedi conclusions at almost every point. Sith students who completed their training during the Ragnos era understood the dark side not as a set of prohibited practices they had chosen to pursue anyway, not as a rebellion against authority, but as the true nature of power as the Force expressed it. They were not rebels. They were true believers in a tradition they could trace back to the founding of their civilization. Tulak Hord was perhaps the most celebrated product of this educational tradition during its golden age, a Sith Lord whose mastery of lightsaber combat and dark-side sorcery was considered unmatched in his era, and whose reputation survived long enough that later students would invoke his name with a reverence usually reserved for figures far older. What is less often discussed about Hord is his role not just as a product of the Sith educational tradition, but as one of its contributors, because he developed techniques that were incorporated into the curriculum after him and created holocrons that students would study for thousands of years after his death. He represents something important about what the Golden Age produced at its best. Individuals who had absorbed everything the tradition offered and then pushed further, adding to the inheritance rather than simply receiving it. The system was designed to produce this kind of advancement. The competition, the constant pressure, the survival requirement, all of it was intended to filter out everyone who would merely maintain the tradition and elevate those rare individuals who would extend it. What the Ragnos era produced, in those long and relatively stable centuries, deserves to be acknowledged even by those who find its values repugnant. It produced a genuine intellectual tradition. The academies of this period were not simply brutal training camps for warriors, though they were certainly that. They were institutions of learning in a real sense, places where the philosophy of the dark side was debated and refined, where the nature of the Force was investigated with something approaching scientific rigor, where historical knowledge was preserved and accumulated and built upon with deliberate care. The Sith understood darkness not as mere cruelty or sadism, but as a principle, a way of engaging with reality that they genuinely believed was more honest about the nature of power than anything the Jedi offered. They built a civilization around that belief that lasted for centuries and produced individuals of genuine greatness. And the school system at its heart was the mechanism that made that continuity possible. The death of Marka Ragnos was one of those moments that alters the trajectory of an entire civilization. He had ruled for over a century, maintaining through a combination of genuine power and sophisticated political management the delicate equilibrium that held the Sith Empire together. His continued existence had been the equilibrium. When he died, the effect was immediate, and it was catastrophic. Two of the most powerful Sith Lords of the era moved to claim the Dark Lord's throne almost before Ragnos had finished dying, and the fact that they could not resolve this competition before an external event intervened tells you something essential about the limitations of the Sith educational tradition at its most fundamental level. The system was extraordinarily good at producing powerful individuals. It was much less good at producing institutions that could survive the loss of the most powerful individual. Naga Sadow and Ludo Kresh were both products of the finest Sith education their era could offer, and they were genuinely opposed in philosophy in ways that went deeper than mere rivalry for a throne. Sadow believed in expansion. He was convinced that the Sith Empire had spent too long consolidating behind its borders, when the galaxy beyond those borders was full of resources and opportunities, and a republic that he was certain was weaker than it appeared. Kresh was a conservative, someone who had watched Ragnos maintain stability through caution and careful management, and concluded that further expansion was more likely to destroy the empire than extend it. These were not simply positions of convenience adopted to serve factional interests. They represented genuine philosophical differences that had been developing throughout both men's careers, and the Academy tradition had given both of them the intellectual tools to articulate and defend those differences with conviction. The crisis accelerated when two explorers from the Republic, Garv and Jory Daragon, stumbled through the boundary of Sith space by accident, their navigation destroyed and their situation entirely desperate. They landed on Korriban at the worst possible moment, during the funeral ceremonies for Marka Ragnos himself, and their arrival immediately became a political instrument in the ongoing contest between Sadow and Kresh. Kresh saw them as Republic spies and argued for their immediate execution, which would have been the safer choice by almost any measure. Sadow recognized in them an opportunity and argued for their exploitation, believing that what he could learn from these Republic travelers could give him the advantage he needed both in his bid for the Dark Lord's throne and in the military campaign he was already planning. Sadow outmaneuvered Kresh, established himself as Dark Lord, and did exactly what he had planned. What followed was the Great Hyperspace War, and it changed Sith education in ways that were both immediate and lasting. The transformation that Sadow drove in Sith training was away from the philosophical comprehensiveness of the Ragnos era and towards something more focused, more military, more concerned with producing effective warriors quickly than with producing fully formed Sith scholars over longer periods. The academies that had been developing students in dark side philosophy and Sith alchemy and the deeper currents of sorcery were redirected toward combat training, military strategy, and the specific skills needed to wage war across multiple star systems simultaneously. What was lost in this redirection was not recoverable in the short term, and the short term was all that mattered now. The war was beginning. The war itself was not what Sadow had promised. The Republic proved far more resilient than his intelligence suggested, and the Jedi Order, which he had calculated as a manageable obstacle, turned out to be considerably more than that. The campaign that Sadow had launched expecting swift victory became a grinding conflict that exposed the limitations both of his military planning and of the combat-focused training he had pushed the academies toward in the years before the fighting began. Sith warriors who had been trained primarily for fighting were confronting Jedi who had been trained for fighting, but also for adaptability and judgment, and the capacity to find solutions that raw power alone could not provide. And the difference showed. The loss was devastating. Sith forces were pushed back and then routed, and Sado himself fled into a retreat that became an exile, wandering the galaxy as a broken remnant of the power he had once commanded. The aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War was the worst crisis the Sith educational tradition had ever faced. The empire that had sustained the academies, that had provided the resources and the institutional continuity that allowed knowledge to be passed from generation to generation, was effectively destroyed. The Sith who survived the war scattered. Some fled to distant worlds hoping to rebuild. Some were captured. Some simply vanished. The great libraries of Korriban, the holocrons and texts that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, were either taken or destroyed or hidden in locations that the surviving Sith hoped to return to and often never did. The formal institutions that Marka Ragnos had built and that Sado had redirected and partially damaged were now simply gone. Their physical structures abandoned or occupied by Republic forces, their faculties scattered beyond any possibility of immediate reassembly. But knowledge is harder to destroy than the buildings that house it. Some of the Sith who survived found their way to worlds where they could rebuild, in hiding if necessary, on a smaller scale if necessary, but rebuild nonetheless. The teachings that had been formalized during the Ragnos era survived in fragmented form in holocrons that had been concealed before the Republic arrived. In the memories of masters who had escaped, in the traditions of Force-sensitive communities on worlds that had been part of the Empire and now existed in uncertain territory between a collapsed Sith order and a victorious Republic. The flame of Sith learning was reduced to an ember. But an ember, in the right hands, can always be made into a fire. Freedon Nad was not a survivor of the Great Hyperspace War in the direct sense. He was a Jedi who came to Sith teachings afterward, drawn to the dark side through the same restless hunger for forbidden knowledge that had driven the original exiles millennia before him. Nad sought out surviving Sith knowledge with a determination that his Jedi training had given him the discipline to sustain over the years it took. Found it in the scattered remnants of what had survived the war, mastered it, and then took it somewhere new. He chose a world called Onderon, where he established himself as ruler and built a dark side tradition that would endure for centuries and produce students whose students would eventually reshape the galaxy in ways that could not have been predicted from the starting point of one fallen Jedi and one remote world. The story of Nad is, in one sense, the story of a single ambitious individual who made a choice his training had told him never to make. In another sense, it is the story of how the Sith educational tradition survived the destruction of the institution that had carried it. Because traditions are ultimately carried not in buildings, but in people. The period following the Great Hyperspace War was one in which the formal Sith Academy tradition existed more as memory and aspiration than as present reality. The great institutions of learning that the Ragnos era had built were gone. What remained were fragments, survivors, scattered knowledge preserved in hiding. But the galaxy has a way of drawing certain kinds of people towards certain kinds of knowledge, regardless of how well that knowledge is concealed. And the centuries after the war produced a generation of Force users who were hungry for something that the established order could not provide. Exar Kun was the most remarkable of these. He had been trained as a Jedi, taken into the Order as a young man, and educated at the temple on Coruscant with a level of raw talent that his masters found extraordinary. and an ambition that some of them found troubling in the specific way that genuinely exceptional. Ambition is always troubling to institutions that have rules about what ambition is permitted to pursue. Kun chafed under the restrictions of Jedi teaching, not because he disagreed with everything the Jedi taught, but because he disagreed with the Jedi's insistence that some knowledge was simply unavailable to him, that certain questions could not be asked, and certain paths could not be explored regardless of how capable or how careful the person doing the exploring might be. He wanted more than the Jedi ceiling allowed, and the Jedi ceiling, as it always did, pushed the person pressing against it outward rather than upward. His journey toward the dark side began with the question rather than the answer. He found references in Jedi archives to knowledge the Order refused to share with him, to practices and powers that predated the Republic. And instead of accepting the prohibition, he began finding other ways to learn. The path led him through worlds where the memory of the Sith Empire still clung to the stone, toward artifacts and texts that the Jedi had thought they had adequately secured. And eventually, through a chain of discovery and contact that would take considerable time to trace in full, it led him to Onderon and to the spirit of Freeden Nad, the long-dead Sith Lord, whose influence had never fully left that world, and who recognized in this ambitious young Jedi exactly the kind of student who deserved to be further corrupted. Nad's spirit guided Kun to Korriban itself, the ancient home world whose tombs held things far more active than the historical records of a dead empire. Kun went there not fully committed to the dark side, still telling himself that he was a scholar, investigating dangerous knowledge rather than a practitioner embracing it. Korriban ended that self-deception with characteristic efficiency. In the depths of an ancient tomb, Kun was trapped under a collapsing ceiling and faced with a simple choice: give himself fully to the dark side and survive, or maintain the principles he was already only nominally following and be crushed in the dark beneath thousands of years of stone. He chose the dark side. The choice was made not through philosophical conviction in that moment, but through pure survival instinct, which the spirits of the ancient Sith Lords, observing from within their tombs, understood completely. The dark side did not care why you chose it. It cared only that you did, and that once you had chosen it, you did not look back. What Kun became after Korriban is one of the most studied figures in the history of Sith education. Not because he was the most powerful Sith who ever lived, though his power was genuinely extraordinary, but because of what he built and how he tried to teach it. After contact with the spirit of Marka Ragnos himself, channeled through a Sith artifact of tremendous potency, Kun was transformed into something more than just another fallen Jedi. He was given knowledge and power that had been waiting for the right recipient for centuries. And then he set about doing something that no Sith in the years since the Great Hyperspace War had managed. He tried to rebuild the institution, not just preserve the tradition in hiding, actually rebuild the institution, create physical spaces for systematic instruction, gather students who would learn from him deliberately rather than stumbling onto dark side teachings by accident. The world he chose was Yavin 4, a jungle moon whose enormous ancient temples had been built by the Massassi, a species that Naga Sado had shaped into warrior slaves during the era before the Great Hyperspace War. The Massassi and their temples represented something that Kun immediately recognized as useful: a ready-made culture of dark side devotion and a set of physical structures already saturated with centuries of Force activity. not specifically aligned with the formal Sith tradition, but close enough that Kun could work with what was already there rather than building from nothing. The temples of Yavin 4 were not Korriban, but they would do. They would more than do. What Kun established on Yavin 4 was something genuinely new in the history of Sith education. He created a school, a real one, with students who came to him deliberately and were taught systematically, but the students he recruited were not Sith in any traditional sense, and the curriculum was not drawn entirely from the Sith tradition as the academies of Korriban had taught it. Kun reached outward. He sent a call to every Jedi Knight and Jedi Master in the Order who had ever felt the pull of the dark side or the frustration of the Jedi's limitations or the specific agony of knowing that there were things you could do, things you could feel yourself capable of, that the Order was telling you must never be attempted. He offered them something the Jedi never had: freedom. Come to Yavin 4. Learn what you were never permitted to learn. Become what you were always capable of being. The response was more significant than the Jedi Order wanted to acknowledge afterward. A substantial number of Jedi accepted his invitation. Enough to constitute a real force. Enough to constitute a real school. These fallen Jedi became the core of what Kun called the Brotherhood of the Sith, a name that deliberately invoked the ancient tradition while also announcing itself as something new. The Brotherhood was not organized along the strict hierarchical lines of the old Sith Empire's academies. Kun was its undisputed master, and no one who spent any time in his presence was likely to forget that fact for very long. But beneath him, the structure was more fluid than traditional Sith hierarchies had allowed, more focused on shared purpose than on the constant internal competition for advancement that the old academies had normalized. Kun was making a practical calculation as much as a philosophical choice. He needed his students to function as a coherent force, not to exhaust themselves competing with each other while he was preparing to wage war on the Republic and the Jedi Order simultaneously. Internal competition was a luxury he could not afford at this particular moment. The teaching Kun did on Yavin 4 was remarkable in its ambition and its pace. He drew on the Sith knowledge he had accumulated through his encounters with Nad's spirit and the tombs of Korriban and the artifact that had connected him to Ragnos, and he transmitted that knowledge with an urgency and an intensity that the old academies had not typically employed. The old academies worked on timescales measured in years and decades, building students up slowly through a careful progression of increasingly demanding instruction. Kun did not have years and decades. He was preparing an assault, and the people he was teaching needed to be capable of operating in that assault as quickly as possible. What he produced was not the deep, systematic education that the Ragnos-era academies had valued. It was something more targeted, more immediate, genuinely powerful in its own terms, but narrower than what had come before. The Massassi occupied a complicated position within Kun's educational vision. They were already his most devoted followers, shaped by generations of Sith influence into a warrior culture that was genuinely formidable, but constrained in ways that their history had made almost impossible to overcome. Kun used their abilities as a force multiplier and their temples as the physical infrastructure of his school. But he did not educate the Massassi in the dark side arts, in the same way he educated his fallen Jedi students. They were the foundation on which his academy rested, not its primary students. This choice would have consequences that Kun either did not consider or chose to ignore. The Massassi's devotion to him was absolute, but it was devotion of a kind that the dark side had long since rendered unsustainable. A devotion that Kun would one day draw on in a way that destroyed them entirely. The Great Sith War that resulted from Kun's campaign against the Republic was one of the most devastating conflicts of its era. For a period, it appeared that Kun and the Brotherhood might actually succeed, that the force assembled on Yavin 4 might be sufficient to bring down the Republic and the Jedi Order simultaneously. They were not. The Jedi rallied. The Republic found reserves of strength that Kun's intelligence had not accounted for. And in the end, the Jedi Council gathered the full strength of the Order and aimed it at Yavin 4, at the Academy, at the source of what Kun had built. Kun, recognizing what was coming, did something that was characteristically Sith in its ruthlessness and characteristically Sith in its particular form of cowardice. He sacrificed the Massassi, drawing the life force from the entire species in a ritual of extraordinary dark side power, and used that power to preserve himself within the stones of the temple, a spirit imprisoned but not destroyed, waiting with the patience that dark side entities always seem to develop, once they no longer had a body that could be killed. The Academy on Yavin 4 went dark. The Massassi were gone. The fallen Jedi had been killed or captured. But the temples remained, and within them, Exar Kun remained, and the dark side energy he had poured into those stones over the years of his occupation remained with him, waiting. The Academy was over as a functioning institution, but its legacy was not. Thousands of years later, those same temples would become a Jedi training facility, and the spirit of Kun would stir within their stones, and a new generation of students would find themselves confronting something they had not expected in what they had thought was merely an interesting archaeological site. Some lessons in the dark side take a very long time to finish being taught. The centuries following Exar Kun's defeat were a complicated period for the continuity of Sith education. The formal institutions were gone again, destroyed or abandoned in the wake of another catastrophic conflict. The knowledge survived in fragments, as it always had, in holocrons concealed on distant worlds, in the memories of individuals who had learned from masters, who had touched the original tradition. The Jedi Order maintained vigilance, watching for any sign that the Sith tradition was rebuilding itself. For a time, it appeared that the vigilance was working. For a time, it appeared that the chain of transmission that had carried Sith knowledge from the original exiles through all the centuries of the Empire and all the conflicts afterward might finally be broken. The Mandalorian Wars changed everything, not just in the obvious ways involving armies and territory and political power, but in the subtler ways that large conflicts always change the people who fight them and the traditions those people carry. Revan was a Jedi Knight who had felt the Order's restrictions as acutely as Exar Kun had. And like Kun, he had chosen to act against those restrictions rather than simply endure them. Unlike Kun, Revan's initial transgression was not toward the dark side, but toward what he believed was simple moral necessity, leading Jedi and Republic forces into the Mandalorian Wars against the explicit wishes of the Jedi Council. But war moves people in directions they did not originally intend, and the directions it moved, Revan led him eventually to Malachor V, and to the ancient Sith teachings housed there, and to the process of becoming something the galaxy would have to reckon with in an entirely new way. What Revan and Malak built after their transformation was the most formally structured Sith academy that had existed since the days of Marka Ragnos. They chose Korriban. It was the obvious choice. The world whose stones carried the accumulated weight of the tradition, whose tombs held the power and the knowledge and the active presences of the greatest Sith Lords in history, whose landscape had been shaped over millennia by exactly the kind of force use that Revan and Malak were now embracing. They did not merely arrive on Korriban and claim it. They built on it. They established an academy that was, in its ambition and comprehensiveness, the most complete attempt to rebuild the Sith educational tradition that had been made since the Great Hyperspace War had scattered it. The structure of the Korriban Academy under Revan and Malak was precise in ways that reflected Revan's military mind as much as his dark side philosophy. At the foundation were the acolytes, young Force sensitives, who had been identified as potential Sith and brought to Korriban to begin their training. They were not students in the conventional sense. They were candidates, people who had demonstrated enough potential to warrant the investment of resources and instruction, but who had not yet proven themselves worthy of the title of Sith warrior or the recognition of a Sith Lord. Between an acolyte arriving on Korriban and that acolyte becoming a Sith, there was a process of evaluation that was continuous, comprehensive, and completely unforgiving. The overseers were the instructors who managed this evaluation, and they occupied a position within the academy's hierarchy that was simultaneously powerful and precarious. An overseer had authority over the acolytes beneath them that was nearly absolute within the limits the system established. They could assign tasks, withhold resources, direct training exercises, and make the small daily decisions that accumulated over time into the difference between a student who survived and a student who did not. But overseers were also themselves measured constantly against the standards of the Sith Lords above them in the hierarchy, expected to produce results that demonstrated their worth as teachers and as practitioners of the dark side. An overseer whose acolytes consistently failed to advance was an overseer who would soon need to explain that failure to someone who would not find the explanation satisfying. The curriculum at Korriban drew on both the ancient Sith tradition and on what Revan had learned during the Mandalorian Wars and through his encounter with the Sith teachings at Malachor. It covered lightsaber combat in forms that drew on both Jedi techniques and older Sith styles developed independently of Jedi influence over the centuries of the Empire's existence. It included training in the Force abilities that the Jedi would have described as dark side, the manipulation of fear and pain, the channeling of aggression into Force strength, the techniques of Sith lightning, and the other expressions of power through domination that were the dark side's most characteristic and most visible gifts. It included instruction in Sith philosophy and history, because Revan understood that warriors who knew why they were fighting were more effective than warriors who were simply pointing in a direction and told to attack. And it included the element that perhaps more than anything else defined what made the Korriban Academy distinctive from any conventional school: the tomb trials. The tombs of the Valley of the Dark Lords were not merely historical sites. They were classrooms of a kind that no formal curriculum could replace or approximate. Each of the great tombs held, within its chambers and corridors and the elaborate traps and guardians that their inhabitants had established, a combination of physical danger, Force-related challenge, and the accumulated dark side presence of whatever Sith Lord had been interred there over the centuries. To be sent into a tomb was not a simple test of bravery or even of combat skill. It was a comprehensive assessment of whether an acolyte had developed enough sensitivity to the dark side to navigate an environment saturated with it, enough skill to handle what the tomb's protective systems directed at them, enough psychological resilience to function under the oppressive dark side pressure that the tombs generated naturally and continuously, and enough raw intelligence to solve whatever specific challenge the tomb had been built around. Acolytes who returned from the tombs with whatever proof or artifact they had been sent to retrieve had demonstrated something the overseers could not fully evaluate in the training chambers. Acolytes who did not return had demonstrated something else, something that the Academy incorporated into its overall understanding of what it was working with. The competitive dynamic among acolytes within the Academy was not merely tolerated by the instructors. It was encouraged, structured, and deliberately maintained as a central feature of the educational experience. Acolytes competed for the attention of overseers, for access to better training resources, for the small advantages that accumulated into significant differences in their development over the months and years of their time at Korriban. They competed for survival in a more literal sense as well, because the Academy did not protect its students from each other with any particular enthusiasm or consistency. If one acolyte challenged another and the confrontation proved fatal, that was not a disciplinary matter requiring investigation and judgment. It was information about which of the two had been stronger, and information was what the Academy was always in the business of collecting. The survivors were what mattered. The dead had already told the Academy everything it needed to know about them. The philosophical education Revan formalized at Korriban was something that later historians would debate extensively. Revan had come to the dark side through genuine philosophical engagement rather than through emotional collapse or desperate circumstances, and the teachings he established at the Academy reflected this. Students were not simply taught to embrace rage and hatred as ends in themselves, as cruder interpretations of Sith philosophy sometimes implied. They were taught to understand the Force as something that responded to will, to ambition, to the refusal to be limited by sentiment or by the fear of what power might make you capable of. They were taught to see the Jedi not as morally superior beings restraining themselves for righteous reasons, but as Force users who had chosen to suppress their own potential, and then called that suppression wisdom. This was a more sophisticated argument for the dark side than pure emotion provided, and it produced graduates who could defend what they believed with coherent reasoning rather than merely feeling it. What the Korriban Academy produced in its years of operation under the Jedi Civil War was a generation of Sith warriors and Sith thinkers who were in many ways the most complete expression of what the tradition had been working toward since Ajunta Pol first looked at the red sands of Korriban and started thinking about what he wanted to build. They were powerful. The combat training was rigorous, and the Force instruction was comprehensive, and the tomb trials filtered out everyone who lacked the combination of strength and adaptability the Sith required. But beyond power, they were committed. They understood what they believed and why they believed it. They had been educated in a tradition that stretched back thousands of years, and that they could trace and articulate and argue for. That made them something qualitatively different from mere warriors who had chosen the wrong side. It made them Sith in the full sense that the ancient tradition had always intended, people who were not simply working for a dark side cause, but were genuinely inhabited by a dark side philosophy. The Academy continued operating through the turbulent final years of the Jedi Civil War, through the loss of Revan himself, and then of Malak, into the period of chaos and transition that followed. But it was not the only institution of dark side learning active in this era. The contrast between what had been built on Korriban and what existed elsewhere in the galaxy at this same moment reveals something essential about the fundamental tensions within the Sith educational philosophy that had never been fully resolved. Not in the days of Marka Ragnos, not in the days of Exar Kun, not in the days of Revan. And those tensions, unresolved, were about to produce something that had no real precedent in the long history of how the Sith had chosen to teach their darkness. The other school was on Malachor V, and it had been built by someone who believed that everything Revan had accomplished at Korriban, however impressive it was on its own terms, was still missing the most important lesson the dark side had ever had to offer. The Traius Academy on Malachor V was not built to produce Sith in the way that any previous institution had understood the term. This distinction matters because every other Sith academy in the tradition's long history, however much it differed in its methods or its philosophy or its specific curriculum, had been built around a shared assumption that the purpose of Sith education was to identify individuals of sufficient potential and transform them through instruction and trial and the application of controlled pressure over time into warriors and sorcerers and thinkers capable of serving and advancing the Sith cause. The academy at Korriban, under Revan, had done this. The temples of Exar Kun on Yavin 4 had done this. The institutions of the Ragnos era had done this with more sophistication and more comprehensiveness than almost any other form, but still fundamentally toward the same end. You took someone with potential and you made them into something stronger. That was what a Sith academy was for. Traya did not believe this, or rather, she believed that the traditional understanding of what Sith education was for had been missing something essential from the very beginning, something so fundamental that all the power produced by all the academies across all the centuries of Sith history had been power of a fundamentally limited kind, and that the limitation was structural rather than a matter of technique or philosophy or the quality of individual teachers and students. The academies had always been trying to make students strong. Traya wanted to make students truly dangerous, and she had concluded, through a philosophical journey that had taken her from Jedi Master to Sith Lord, to something that defied either label, that strength and danger were not the same thing, and that in fact they might be in considerable tension with each other. She had been a Jedi. This matters because it shaped everything about what she built at Malachor, not in the way that Exar Kun or Revan were shaped by their Jedi training, as former students who had left an institution behind and built something in opposition to it. Her relationship with the Jedi tradition was far more complicated than simple rejection. Kriya had been a Jedi historian and a Jedi teacher before she was anything else. Someone whose primary vocation within the Order had been the understanding and transmission of Jedi knowledge to the next generation. She had cared about what the Jedi were and what they were trying to do in a way that went beyond institutional loyalty into something closer to love. She had believed in the Order, and then she had watched it fail in ways that she found inexcusable. Watched it make decisions that seemed to her the product not of malice, but of a deep philosophical blindness that the Order had been carefully cultivating in itself for generations. A blindness so thorough that it had become invisible from the inside. Her departure was not the departure of someone who had been seduced by power or broken by loss. It was the departure of someone who had concluded, after long and careful consideration, that the institution she had given her life to was broken in ways it could not fix from within. Her journey through the dark side after that departure was its own education, extended and painful, and ultimately transformative in ways she had not anticipated when she began it. She sought out Sith knowledge, encountered Sith traditions and Sith practitioners, and in the process came to understand the dark side in terms that the Jedi would have found disturbing and that many of the Sith she encountered would have found equally uncomfortable, because what she concluded about the dark side was not the triumphant endorsement that fallen Jedi usually arrived at. She found the dark side powerful, and she found it illuminating about aspects of the Force that the Jedi philosophy deliberately refused to examine, but she also found it limited in ways that its practitioners almost universally failed to recognize, because the specific nature of its limitations was very difficult to see from inside the tradition. The dark side made you powerful. The dark side also made you certain in your power, in a way that prevented you from recognizing what you could not do. And the things you could not do were often the most important things. Malachor 5 was where all of this crystallized into something she could build. The world itself was a wound in the Force, a place where the activation of the mass shadow generator during the final battle of the Mandalorian Wars had killed so many people so quickly and so violently that the Force itself seemed to have recoiled from what had happened there, leaving behind a darkness that was not the structured darkness of Sith philosophy, but something more raw, more fundamental, more like what the dark side had been before anyone had organized it into a tradition at all. The Treyas Academy, built within the ruins of an ancient Sith structure that had already existed on Malachor before the war, was saturated in this energy from its foundation stones outward. It was not a comfortable place to practice the Force. It was not designed to be. The purpose of the environment was not to amplify power. As Korriban's dark side saturation had amplified the abilities of students training there, the purpose of the environment at Malachor was to strip things away, to remove from Force users the comfortable assumptions about their own strength that most of them had been carrying since the beginning of their training. The assumptions that were, in Treyas' analysis, the thing most preventing them from understanding what the Force actually was. The students who came to Traya, or who were led to her, or who found their way to Malachor through the various channels by which dark side knowledge attracted the people who sought it, came from many different backgrounds. Some were Sith, who had survived the chaos of the Jedi Civil War's aftermath. Some were Dark Jedi, who had learned enough of the dark side to know they wanted more of it, and had heard of a teacher on a dead world who understood it in ways that other teachers did not. Some came by stranger routes, through circumstances that had brought them to the dark side's attention without any deliberate seeking on their part. What all of them shared, regardless of origin, was that they arrived on Malachor knowing almost nothing about what was going to happen to them, and that ignorance was not accidental. Traya believed that students who arrived expecting a specific kind of education were students whose expectations would interfere with what the education was actually trying to do. She preferred to work with empty vessels, or as close to empty as she could find. The Treyas Academy operated at 3 levels, which Traya conceived as stages of something closer to philosophical transformation than to conventional dark side instruction. At the outer level, the Academy appeared to function in ways recognizable from other Sith training traditions. Students practiced combat and developed their Force abilities and competed with each other in dynamics that the Korriban model had normalized, and that arriving students therefore found familiar enough to navigate without immediate crisis. This was the level at which the Academy presented itself to students who had just arrived, giving them something they could hold on to while Traya assessed them and decided which of them were capable of going deeper. Most students never went deeper. Most students spent their time at Malachor at this outer level, learning things that were genuinely valuable, developing real power that the dark side offered in abundance to those willing to pursue it, and then left or died without ever understanding what the academy had actually been built to teach. They went away stronger than they had arrived. They did not go away changed in the way that Trier was attempting to change people. Those assessed as capable of more were taken to the inner levels of the Trier structure, where the teaching changed in ways that were initially disorienting, and then, for those who could sustain the disorientation long enough to emerge from the other side of it, genuinely transformative. The inner teaching was about the Force itself rather than about techniques for using it. Trier had conclusions about the nature of the Force that were original in ways that the Sith tradition had rarely produced. Conclusions that challenged not just Jedi philosophy, but the basic assumptions of Sith philosophy as well, including assumptions that most Sith practitioners had not noticed they were making because those assumptions were so thoroughly embedded in the tradition that they had become invisible. She believed that the Force was not simply a power source to be drawn on more or less skillfully, not simply a dimension of reality to be aligned with in one direction or another. She believed the Force had something closer to intention, and that the intention was problematic in ways that both Jedi and Sith had failed to recognize, because both traditions had organized themselves around serving the Force, one in the light and one in the darkness, rather than questioning whether the Force deserved to be served at all. The practical consequence of this philosophy for the Academy's inner curriculum was a form of teaching that systematically undermined the students' dependence on the Force as a source of strength and certainty. Trier wanted her most advanced students to be able to function when their connection to the Force was compromised or absent, to have developed strength that was genuinely their own rather than borrowed from an energy field they were attached to in ways they did not fully understand and could not fully control. This was not the kind of strength that the Korriban model produced. The Korriban model produced students who were powerful in the Force in the way that a creature adapted to one specific environment is powerful within that environment, magnificent under the right conditions, and vulnerable in ways they might never discover because they were never placed in the wrong conditions long enough to learn what those vulnerabilities were. Trier wanted students who could function in any environment, under any conditions, including conditions that removed every advantage their training had given them. The person through whom this philosophy was most fully expressed was not a Sith in any conventional sense of the word. She was known as the Jedi Exile, a former Jedi Knight, whose connection to the conclusion of the Jedi Civil War and to the wound in the Force that Malachor had become made her unlike any other Force user in the galaxy, in a specific way that Trier had spent considerable time thinking about before she encountered her. The Exile had a relationship to the Force that was the product of trauma rather than of training. And the nature of that relationship was something Trier recognized immediately as significant, because what the Exile represented was a demonstration that it was possible to survive the loss of a conventional Force connection and emerge from that loss with something that was not simply a diminished version of what had existed before, but something genuinely different. Something that the existing vocabulary of Force instruction could not quite capture, but that Trier believed pointed toward what she had been trying to articulate for years. Trier took the Exile as her primary student. The dynamic that developed between them was the fullest expression of what the Trias Academy was actually trying to do. More complete than anything the formal curriculum conveyed, because what Trier gave to the Exile was not merely instruction, but a kind of engagement that went beyond what any previous master in the Sith tradition had offered to any student. She taught with depth and with care that no simple self-interest could have motivated, because the investment she made in the exile's development went far beyond what was required for the Academy's stated purposes. But she also used the exile, manipulated her in ways she never entirely concealed and never entirely admitted. And the tension between those two things, the genuine teaching and the genuine manipulation existing simultaneously within the same relationship, was not a contradiction in Tria's philosophy. It was the central expression of it. Betrayal, as Tria understood it, and as she designed the Traeus Academy to teach it, was not simply a political act or a survival strategy or the expression of ambition overcoming loyalty. It was a form of instruction that could not be replicated through any other means. The student who was betrayed by their master learned something that no direct instruction could have conveyed, something about the nature of attachment and the nature of power, and the nature of what it meant to have built your strength on a foundation that someone else had laid, that could only be understood from inside the experience of having that foundation removed. And a master who was betrayed by their student learned something equally irreplaceable, something about what they had built in that student and what they had failed to build, and what the ultimate limits of any teacher's influence over the direction of their students' development actually were. The Academy was built to use betrayal as a pedagogical instrument, not to allow it to happen as an incidental side effect of the competition between students or the natural process of students outgrowing masters, but to structure the learning environment so that betrayal was the mechanism through which the deepest lesson was delivered. The lesson could not be explained. It had to be experienced. Tria designed the Academy to make sure it was experienced. She was eventually betrayed by her own two most advanced students, Darth Nihilus and Darth Sion, who stripped her of her connection to the Force and expelled her from the Academy she had built. The irony of this was not lost on her. She had created the conditions in which this was possible. She had taught them, however indirectly, the skills and the willingness that made what they did achievable. And then she had experienced the thing she had designed the Academy to deliver, not as the teacher on the instructional side of it, but as the student on the receiving side. And she discovered that understanding something in theory and living through it in practice were not the same experience, even for someone who had thought about the subject as carefully as she had. The betrayal hurt in ways that her philosophy had not prepared her for, which was, perhaps, exactly the point, and exactly the thing she should have known was coming. Nihilus and Sion used the Academy for their own purposes after her expulsion, and what they made of it was something Tria found both predictable and disappointing when she eventually returned to a form of teaching through her relationship with the exile. They had taken the institution she built and reduced it to something more familiar, a source of dark side warriors trained along lines closer to the Korriban model than to anything Tria had been working toward. The inner teaching was abandoned. The philosophical depth was replaced with a simpler and more aggressive curriculum, focused on producing fighters and sorcerers capable of prosecuting the campaign against the Jedi remnants that Nihilus and Sion were pursuing across the galaxy. Malachor V, under their stewardship, was powerful and genuinely dangerous. It was not what Tria had been building, but her real academy, the one that existed in the relationship between herself and the exile, rather than in the stones of the Traeus structure, continued in different forms and different places until the exile returned to Malachor and brought everything there to an end. The destruction of Malachor V itself, which the exile triggered through the activation of the mass shadow generator for the second time in the world's haunted history, erased the physical structure of the Trajas Academy permanently and completely. What it could not erase was the philosophical tradition Treya had created in the decade or so of the Academy's actual operation. Because that tradition existed not in the stone of the Academy, but in the mind and the experience of the one student who had gone through its innermost levels and come out the other side. The exile survived. The most important parts of what Treya had taught survived with her, and what the exile did with what Treya had given her. In the long centuries that followed her disappearance from known space into the unknown regions in pursuit of Revan's trail, is a story whose full dimensions remain uncertain even to those who have looked most carefully for its traces. But the tradition did not die with the Academy. It almost never does. The centuries that followed the destruction of the Trajas Academy were centuries in which the Sith tradition as a whole existed in a state that later historians would describe as institutional void. There were Sith, or people who called themselves Sith, during this period. There were always Force users who found their way to dark side teachings and developed abilities that placed them outside the Jedi Order's comfortable categories. But the formal Academy tradition, the organized institutional transmission of Sith knowledge from generation to generation in structured physical environments with defined curricula and defined hierarchies, was absent in a way it had not been since the immediate aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War. The flame was down again, not quite extinguished, but burning at a level too low to be clearly visible from a distance. What ended this period, and did so with a comprehensiveness and permanence that surprised everyone who witnessed it, was the return of something that most of the Republic had believed was gone beyond any possibility of recovery. The Sith Empire that came back to known space in the era roughly 3,000 years before the Battle of Yavin was not a remnant struggling to rebuild from what had survived the previous collapse. It was a complete civilization that had been developing in isolation for over 1,000 years under the rule of an emperor whose immortality had allowed him to maintain continuity and direction across a time span that would have seen dozens of ordinary rulers come and go. When the Empire of Vitiate returned, it returned with the full force of everything that preparation represented, and the Academy it rebuilt on Korriban was the most complete expression of the Sith educational tradition that had ever existed. The Korriban Academy under the reconstituted Sith Empire drew on everything that the tradition had developed across its long history. It drew on the philosophical comprehensiveness of the Ragnos era, the military precision of the Revan model, the architectural ambition of the intermediate centuries, and it organized all of it into a system so thorough in its design and so careful in its internal logic that scholars studying it afterward found themselves simultaneously horrified and impressed. This was not an improvised institution. It was the product of 1,000 years of consideration about what a Sith Academy should be and should do, and it reflected that consideration in every aspect of its structure and operation. The physical layout of the Korriban Academy under the reconstituted empire made a statement before anything else. The ancient tombs of the Valley of the Dark Lords remained, as they always had been, the spiritual heart of the world and the ultimate testing ground for students who had progressed far enough to be assessed in the most demanding way the tradition offered. But surrounding the valley, built in Korriban's red stone, with an ambition that earlier structures on the same site had only partially matched, was an academy complex designed to house and train hundreds of students simultaneously, without any of those students losing the sense of pressure and competition that the Sith educational tradition had always required as its operating condition. This was not a school for a handful of exceptional individuals. This was a machine for the production of Sith practitioners in the numbers that an empire at war required, and it was designed to produce them without sacrificing the quality that the tradition had always insisted was the point of the whole enterprise. Acolytes came to Korriban from every corner of the Sith Empire, and their arrival was itself the beginning of their assessment. They came from Sith families that had been preparing children for the academy since birth, from conquered worlds where Imperial agents had identified Force-sensitive individuals worth redirecting toward Korriban, from circumstances as varied and as unpredictable as the galaxy itself. The one thing they shared was ignorance of what was about to happen to them, and the Academy made no effort to remedy that ignorance before their education in the reality of it began. There was no orientation in the gentle sense of the word. There was arrival. And then there was the immediate confrontation with an environment that was asking, from the first moment, whether you were going to be adequate to what it required of you. The overseers were the first faces the Academy showed to its new students, and the relationship between an overseer and the acolytes under their supervision was the most immediate and most personal expression of what Sith education under the reconstituted empire had become. An overseer's authority over their assigned acolytes was nearly absolute within the formal structure of the academy. They assigned tasks and withheld resources and directed training exercises and made the daily decisions that accumulated over weeks and months into the difference between a student who advanced and a student who did not. But the overseers were not simply administrators of a curriculum. They were themselves continuously assessed against the results they produced, measured against the standards of the Sith Lords above them in the hierarchy, with the same relentless attention to outcome that they applied to the students below them. The hierarchy of the academy extended in both directions from any given point within it, and no position within it offered immunity from the pressure that the Sith tradition applied to everyone it touched. The tasks assigned to acolytes had a character that distinguished them from anything a conventional educational system would recognize. They were not exercises in a controlled environment designed to develop specific skills progressively and safely, where failure was a learning opportunity and the student was protected from consequences that exceeded the pedagogical purpose. They were tests of what was already there, conducted in conditions where failure carried the consequences that failure in the actual operation of a Sith Lord's will would carry. The distinction was not incidental. The Academy was not trying to build capabilities in students who lacked them. It was trying to identify capabilities in students who possessed them and eliminate the students who did not. And the most efficient way to do this was to put students in situations where the capabilities were required and observe what happened. What happened told the Academy everything it needed to know. The tomb trials remained the most definitive of these tests, as they had been at every Korriban-based academy in the tradition's history. The tombs of the Valley of the Dark Lords were not historical sites with security arrangements around them. They were active environments saturated with the accumulated dark side presence of everything that had ever happened within their walls, inhabited in some cases by guardians that the entombed Sith Lords had established before their deaths, and crossed by traps and challenges that expressed the specific personality and the specific values of the individual whose remains lay within them. To be sent into a tomb was a comprehensive assessment that no single dimension of training could prepare you for in isolation. It required force sensitivity, physical capability, intellectual flexibility, psychological resilience under conditions of genuine oppressive pressure, and the capacity to make good decisions in an environment that was actively working against good decision-making. Students who came back had demonstrated all of these things in combination. Students who did not come back had demonstrated the limits of what they possessed, which was the only remaining information about them that the Academy needed. The competition among acolytes within the Academy was not something the instructors managed or limited or attempted to channel into productive rather than destructive forms. It was something they encouraged, structured, and deliberately maintained as a central feature of the educational environment, because the Sith tradition had always understood that competition was itself a form of instruction that classrooms could not replicate. Acolytes competed for overseer attention, for access to better training facilities, for the small advantages that accumulated into significant differences in their development over time. They competed for survival in a more literal sense as well, because the Academy's protective interest in its students extended exactly as far as the students' usefulness to the Academy justified, and no further. An acolyte who was killed by another acolyte in the course of the competition the Academy encouraged was not a victim of Academy negligence. They were a data point in the ongoing assessment of who was stronger, and the Academy treated them accordingly. The ambition of every acolyte in the Academy was directed upward toward the Sith Lords, who moved through the institution, using its facilities and sometimes taking direct interest in particular students they assessed as having potential worth developing personally. To attract a Sith Lord's attention as a potential apprentice was the greatest possible advancement available within the Academy's structure, because the direct master-apprentice relationship provided something the institutional curriculum fundamentally could not: the complete transmission of a Sith Lord's specific knowledge and the direct channeling of their instruction toward one person's specific potential. The Academy trained acolytes to be Sith. The Sith Lord made them into something beyond that, or tried to, and the success or failure of that attempt determined what kind of Sith the student ultimately became. The archives at Korriban, under the reconstituted Empire, represented the most comprehensive repository of Sith knowledge ever assembled in a single accessible location. The Empire had spent over 1,000 years in isolation collecting and preserving Sith knowledge that had survived the collapses of previous empires, and when it returned to known space, it brought all of that preservation back with it, augmenting it with everything that could be recovered from the ruins and the hidden caches of what had come before. To study in the Korriban archive was to have access to the full depth of the tradition, from the earliest records of the post-exile era through the golden age of Ragnos, through the various forms the knowledge had taken during the centuries of institutional dispersal. Access to the archive was graduated by the same assessment logic that governed every other aspect of Academy life, with deeper and more powerful knowledge reserved for students who had demonstrated the advancement that warranted it, so that the archive itself was a map of the hierarchy expressed in physical terms, and your position within it told you and everyone around you exactly where you were in the tradition's estimate of what you had become. The political dimension of life at the Korriban Academy under the reconstituted Empire was something that distinguished it in emphasis, if not entirely in kind, from what earlier Sith academies had managed. The Sith Empire was a hierarchical civilization in which advancement required not just power, but navigational skill, the capacity to manage relationships with individuals above and below you in the hierarchy without becoming fatally exposed through either submission or aggression at the wrong moment. An acolyte on Korriban was not merely being trained in the Force. They were being introduced, through daily immersive experience, to the political environment in which they would spend the rest of their lives as Sith practitioners, and the skills required for that navigation overlapped considerably with, but were not identical to the skills required to succeed in the tomb trials. You could be genuinely powerful in the Force and still fail catastrophically as a Sith Lord if you could not manage what the hierarchy required of you politically. And the Academy tried to teach this through the dynamics of acolyte competition and overseer relations in ways that prepared students for the larger structure they were entering. What the reconstituted Empire's Academy ultimately produced, across the generations of its operation, was the most professionally trained cohort of Sith practitioners the tradition had ever generated. Not necessarily the most individually brilliant, because individual brilliance was always a function of specific, exceptional people, rather than of the system that trained them. But in terms of the consistent baseline quality of what came out of the Korriban Academy, the reliability with which it produced practitioners who were skilled and committed and politically functional within the Empire's structure, it exceeded everything that had come before it. This was what 1,000 years of preparation looked like when it was finally implemented, and it was impressive in a way that it is possible to acknowledge even from a position that finds everything the Academy stood for and produced deeply troubling. Far from the great academies and their elaborate curricula, in the years after the Jedi Civil War's conclusion and before the reconstituted Empire announced itself to known space, something was happening to the Sith educational tradition that was more radical in its implications than anything Traya had proposed, and more permanent in its eventual consequences than any single academy's destruction. Darth Bane had come through the Sith Academy of his era, a structure maintained on Korriban across the centuries between the Jedi Civil War and his own time, and what he found there was simultaneously a genuine education and a genuine revelation about what the Sith had become. And the revelation was not encouraging. The education was real. The knowledge available in the academy Bane attended was substantial, and he was a student of exceptional ability who absorbed what was available with a thoroughness that his instructors noticed and his peers found threatening. The dark side techniques he developed during his time in the academy were genuine advances on what he had arrived with, and the philosophical instruction gave him frameworks for understanding the dark side that he would spend the rest of his life building on. But what he saw around him in the academy and in the larger Sith organizational structure the academy was embedded within was a tradition that had organized itself around competition so completely that the competition itself had become the point rather than a means toward any meaningful end. The Sith were not competing with each other in order to identify who was strongest and elevate that person to power. They were competing with each other as a form of activity that consumed everything, that left no attention or energy available for the things that a genuinely dangerous tradition would be focused on: the development of power deep enough to actually threaten enemies who were not other Sith. Bane's encounter with the preserved philosophy of Darth Revan, transmitted through a holocron that had survived the centuries since the Jedi Civil War, provided the catalyst that transformed his dissatisfaction into a specific diagnosis and eventually into a specific solution. The rule of two that Bane eventually articulated was not merely a new arrangement for organizing the number of Sith practitioners who would exist at any given time. It was a reconception of what Sith education was for and how it should work. A reconception so fundamental that it effectively ended the Sith Academy tradition as it had existed throughout the institution's history. One master and one apprentice. The master who possessed the power and the knowledge. The apprentice who desired the power and the knowledge enough to kill for it when the time came. Because the desire The genuine burning ambition that was willing to cross any line to be satisfied was the quality that the dark side actually required in its practitioners, and that the academy system had been progressively diluting by creating an environment where advancement was possible through politics and institutional navigation, as much as through genuine development of power. The academy was the opposite of this in Bain's analysis. The academy took many students and processed them through a system that claimed to identify the strongest, but that in practice produced something else. A large class of moderately capable Sith practitioners, people who were genuinely skilled, but who had had their development shaped by the need to survive an institutional environment rather than by the need to push their power to the absolute limit of their potential. The institutional environment rewarded political capability alongside force capability, rewarded the ability to manage relationships and navigate hierarchy alongside the ability to actually use the dark side with genuine depth. These were not the same things. And by rewarding them at the same rate, the academy had been producing a tradition that was broad rather than deep, capable of filling an empire's requirements for dark side practitioners, but not capable of producing the kind of individual power that Bain believed the Sith needed if they were ever going to succeed in what the tradition was actually supposed to be working toward. What Bain built instead of an academy was a relationship. One master and one apprentice, with nothing between them and no institution around them and no structure except the one the relationship itself created. The master's responsibility was to give everything they knew to the apprentice, to transmit the full accumulated depth of the Sith tradition without reservation, to develop the apprentice as fully as the apprentice's specific potential allowed. The apprentice's responsibility was to receive this instruction, to develop beyond it if possible, and eventually to kill the master and take their place. This conclusion to the relationship was not a failure of the system. It was the system's completion, the mechanism by which the tradition would continuously select for genuine strength rather than for institutional loyalty or political survival. An apprentice who could not kill their master was an apprentice who had not developed sufficiently to be entrusted with the tradition's continuation. A master who was killed by their apprentice had done their job correctly, because they had produced someone stronger than themselves. This model required locations for the training to take place, but those locations were not academies in any sense the tradition would have recognized before Bain's time. They were wherever the master happened to be, sometimes a location chosen for its dark side presence, and sometimes a location chosen for nothing more than its distance from Jedi attention. Bain trained his apprentice Darth Zana across multiple environments, beginning in the dark side-saturated ruins of Ruusan, where the Brotherhood of Darkness had made its final stand, and where the energy of what had happened there was thick enough to be physically felt, and continuing through various other locations as the needs of their situation dictated. The training was intensive. In a way, the academy model was structurally incapable of matching, because one master's complete attention devoted to one student produced a depth of instruction that one master's attention divided among many students could never approach. And the student's complete attention devoted to one master, rather than divided across the social and political demands of academy life, allowed a focus of development that the institutional environment had always interrupted. What the Rule of Two training produced, when it worked as Bain intended, was qualitatively different from what the academies had produced even at their best. The individual instruction, the complete transmission of the master's knowledge, the specific calibration of challenges to this particular student's particular needs, rather than to what a curriculum prescribed for students at a given level, All of this created Sith practitioners whose depth was greater than the Academy model could achieve, even when both were working with the same quality of raw material. Bane understood that this came at a cost that an empire builder would find unacceptable, the cost of being able to produce only 2 Sith at a time, leaving the tradition permanently vulnerable to the loss of either. But the vulnerability of a tradition that resided in 2 exceptional individuals was, in his assessment, preferable to the vulnerability of a tradition that resided in many mediocre ones, because exceptionality was what the dark side actually required, and mediocrity was what the academies were producing. The hidden nature of Rule of Two training was not only a practical adaptation to the continued existence of a Jedi Order that would have moved immediately to eliminate any visible Sith presence. It was philosophically necessary to what Bane was trying to accomplish. An apprentice trained in the open, within an institutional structure that had opinions about how the training should proceed and what it should produce, was an apprentice whose development would inevitably be shaped by those opinions. The pressure to conform to institutional expectations, to develop in directions the structure found acceptable and could manage, would inevitably impose a ceiling on what was possible. The apprentice trained in secret, alone with their master, was free of that pressure. They could develop in whatever direction their nature and their master's guidance indicated, without any institutional ceiling on where that development could go, and without any institutional tolerance for the specific forms of development that exceeded comfortable limits. The centuries of the Rule of Two produced a succession of masters and apprentices whose names and whose work are distributed across the subsequent history of the galaxy in ways that are only fully visible in retrospect. Darth Zana succeeded Bane by killing him when she was ready, exactly as the system specified. The chain of masters and apprentices that followed her ran through centuries of quiet accumulation, each pair inheriting what the tradition had built, and each pair adding to it, or failing to add to it, in ways that determined whether the tradition grew or held steady, or occasionally contracted, before the next iteration pushed it forward again. The succession was not always clean. There were periods of uncertainty and periods when the continuation of the tradition seemed less assured than Bane's design intended. But the tradition continued, hidden from the Jedi, who believed they had destroyed the Sith at Ruusan, and did not seriously reconsider that belief for the 1,000 years that followed. The Rule of Two ran through galactic history like a river running underground, invisible to the surface, but present and continuous, and carrying everything the tradition had accumulated in the depth of its current. The training locations used by different masters in the Rule of Two era shared certain consistent features regardless of individual preference. Each master sought environments with meaningful dark side presence, because training in proximity to dark side energy accelerated the development of force sensitivity in ways neutral environments could not match. Each sought isolation sufficient to prevent Jedi detection, which became more sophisticated as the centuries passed, and as the Jedi became more complacent about the threat they believed they had permanently eliminated. And each eventually produced a confrontation with their apprentice, not always in the form of a direct duel and not always at a moment the master had specifically anticipated, but always eventually, because the confrontation was the final examination that determined whether the tradition would continue in the apprentice's hands or would need to begin again from whatever of the master's knowledge and materials could be recovered. Darth Plagueis received the full inheritance of everything the Rule of Two had accumulated across its centuries of operation, and what he added to it was something that drew on his specific nature and his specific genius in ways that the tradition had not previously been able to access. His approach to the dark side was scientific rather than instinctual, analytical rather than passionate, and the research he conducted into the relationship between the Force and biological life, into the midi-chlorians, and what they represented about the way the Force expressed itself through living organisms, represented a genuinely new direction for the Sith tradition. He was not merely transmitting what had come before him to the apprentice who would eventually succeed him. He was extending the tradition into territory it had never explored. And what he learned there would have consequences that extended far beyond his own lifetime, in ways he both understood and, in some crucial respects, failed to anticipate. His apprentice, the being who would eventually become Darth Sidious, received from Plagueis the full technical and philosophical inheritance of the Sith tradition as Plagueis had received it and as Plagueis had extended it, and added to this inheritance something that Plagueis himself had not fully possessed: the political genius to use everything the tradition had built as an instrument of operation in the world of galactic politics and governance, rather than purely in the world of Force practice. What Sidious did with the Sith tradition was to turn it toward ends that the tradition had always nominally pursued, but had never come close to achieving: the actual seizure of galactic power, rather than the perpetual preparation for it that the Rule of Two had in some ways substituted for the thing itself. The training that Sidious gave to his own apprentices was interesting precisely because it departed in specific ways from the Rule of Two tradition that had produced him, and the departures were deliberate rather than accidental. Darth Maul was trained with extraordinary intensity in combat and in the application of Force power to violent confrontation. But the depth and the breadth of the full Sith philosophical tradition that Plagueis had given to Sidious was not given to Maul in the same way. Maul was made into an exceptional instrument for a specific purpose. He was not made into a complete Sith in the way that the Rule of Two had always intended the apprentice to become. This was a choice Sidious made deliberately, and it reflects something about how the Rule of Two tradition had evolved in his hands, because an instrument can be replaced, and a complete Sith successor cannot be so easily controlled. The Inquisitorius that Sidious established after the fall of the Republic and the extermination of the Jedi Order was the most significant departure from the Rule of Two's educational philosophy that the Sith tradition had seen since Bane had established it. The Inquisitors were not Sith in the full sense of the term. They were dark side practitioners, trained in enough of the dark side's methods to function as effective agents of specific purposes, primarily the hunting and elimination of Jedi survivors who had escaped Order 66 and the suppression of Force-sensitive individuals whose existence was not sanctioned by the Emperor's plans. The training they received was targeted rather than comprehensive, calibrated to the capabilities their role required, rather than to the full depth of what the Sith tradition had to offer. They were given enough to do their jobs, and not significantly more. This was a deliberately designed limitation. Sidious was not unaware that training large numbers of dark side practitioners in the full depth of the Sith tradition created risks that a single Sith Lord operating at the peak of his power might not be able to manage. The Inquisitors were powerful enough to be genuinely useful and constrained enough to be genuinely controllable, and the training they received was calibrated to maintain exactly that balance. The locations where they trained, the methods by which their instruction was delivered, the specific content of what they were taught and what they were deliberately not taught, all of this was designed by Sidious with the same precision and the same attention to long-term consequence that he applied to everything he constructed. Beyond the Inquisitors, Sidious maintained other forms of dark side instruction through other institutions and other relationships that existed entirely outside any formal framework. The Emperor's hands were individual dark side practitioners of genuine force sensitivity who were developed through instruction that was closer to the traditional master-apprentice model than the inquisitorious training was, more individualized, more comprehensive in specific respects, more personally connected to Sidious himself as the source of their instruction. They were not being trained to become Sith Lords in the full sense. They were being trained to be maximally useful to a Sith Lord who had already determined what useful meant. The distinction between these two things is the same distinction Trier had tried to address in her academy's deepest teaching, the distinction between strength that is genuinely your own and strength that is borrowed from someone else's definition of what you should be. And it is a distinction that the Sith tradition, despite thousands of years of thinking about power and education and the relationship between them, never fully resolved. The Emperor's primary training facility on Biss was perhaps the most extreme expression of what a single Sith Lord operating without institutional constraint or oversight could create in the way of a dark side environment. The world itself had been deliberately saturated with dark side energy through years of focused effort, creating an ambient force presence comparable to Korriban's natural saturation but more specifically controlled, more precisely calibrated to the kinds of training and research Sidious wanted to conduct there. Biss was not an academy. It was a personal domain that served as a laboratory and a training ground and a repository and a retreat simultaneously, and what happened there was entirely a function of what Sidious chose to do, rather than of any curriculum or institutional structure. The most sensitive work of dark side development in the Empire's era was done on Biss. Invisible to everyone outside the very limited circle of those Sidious had decided to include, and the knowledge produced there was not disseminated through any institution but held by Sidious himself as personal possession. The fall of the Emperor at the Battle of Endor was a catastrophic disruption of the institutional Sith structure. But it was not the same kind of disruption that previous catastrophes had been, because the Rule of Two had been specifically designed to make the tradition resilient against leadership loss. The design worked to the extent that the tradition had never resided in more than two people, and therefore could not be shattered in the way that the Great Hyperspace War had shattered the old Sith Empire's educational institutions. But it also meant that when the last two practitioners of the Rule of Two died within moments of each other, there was nothing left of the formal tradition but what had been written down or preserved in objects that survived them. What followed the fall of the Empire was not a vacuum. The dark side does not leave vacuums. Into the chaos of the post-imperial era came Force users of every description, some with fragments of Sith knowledge acquired through various means, some with dark side power developed in the complete absence of any formal training, some seeking the remnants of the tradition in archives and ruins that the Empire's collapse had suddenly made accessible to anyone willing to look. The tradition was alive but diffuse, present in fragments distributed across the galaxy rather than organized into the coherent whole that any of the historical institutions had represented. The most significant development in dark side education in the period after the Empire's fall was not the kind of dramatic institutional rebuilding that the historical pattern of the Sith tradition might have predicted was coming. It was something much smaller and much more personal. A single man alone, with a very long period of solitude, and a very comprehensive knowledge of the tradition's history, arriving at conclusions about what the Sith had always been doing wrong and what a new beginning might look like. Darth Krayt had come to his understanding of the dark side through a path that was unusual even by the tradition's standards of unusual paths, through his history as a Jedi warrior, through his encounter with the Yuuzhan Vong, and the specific transformation that encounter produced in him, through the long isolation in which he had studied the tradition's full history more carefully than almost anyone had ever had the time or the motivation to do. The academy that Krayt established on Korriban in the years following his emergence from that isolation was built around a single philosophical premise that contradicted the rule of two at its most fundamental level. Bane had been wrong in Krayt's analysis, not about the need to break the army of the Sith, which had genuinely been producing the mediocrity Bane correctly diagnosed. Bane had been wrong about the solution, because the rule of two had taken the Sith tradition's most consistent self-destructive tendency, the turning of Sith practitioners against each other, and attempted to address it by reducing the number of practitioners to a level where that tendency could be managed. The tendency itself remained. The rule of two had not eliminated the instruction to destroy the person above you in the hierarchy as soon as you were capable of it. It had simply reduced the hierarchy to two people. The structure was still organized around internal destruction as its central mechanism. What Krayt built on Korriban instead was organized around a principle that had no genuine precedent in the tradition's long history: unity. The one Sith would not compete with each other in the way that every previous Sith organizational model had required and encouraged. They would be directed by a single will, committed to a shared purpose, and their collective power would be directed entirely outward, rather than consuming itself in the internal competition that had destroyed every previous Sith institution eventually. This was not naivety about the nature of the dark side. Krayt understood as well as anyone what the dark side did to the people who embraced it. His proposal was not that Sith could be made to stop wanting power or stop being ambitious. His proposal was that those desires could be organized around a shared external target rather than around each other. That the dark side's drive for domination could be channeled toward dominating the galaxy rather than toward dominating the person in the next room. The academy Krayt built was designed to produce this kind of practitioner from the beginning of their training. Students who came to Korriban under the One Sith were not placed in the competitive survival dynamics that the Revan model and the reconstituted Empire model had used as their primary instrument of assessment and development. They were placed in an environment that demanded genuine capability and that assessed genuine capability with complete seriousness. But that did not structure the relationships between students as inherently adversarial. Collaboration was not prohibited. It was modeled. The expectation was not that the strongest individual would emerge from the competition by eliminating the others. The expectation was that the group would develop collectively, that the strongest individuals would emerge through their demonstrated contribution to the collective rather than through their demonstrated ability to work against it. The recruitment model for Krayt's academy was among the most broad in the tradition's history. Earlier, Sith academies had drawn from specific populations aligned with whatever empire or order had built them. From the Sith species itself in the earliest era, from the Sith Empire's subject populations in the reconstituted Empire era, from specific networks of dark side practitioners in the Revan model. Krayt's academy recruited from wherever Force-sensitive individuals could be found, regardless of their origin, their species, their prior experience with either the Jedi or the Sith. This produced a student body more diverse in background and starting framework than any previous Sith academy had typically achieved, and that diversity was not a problem to be managed, but an asset to be developed, a source of different perspectives and different capabilities that the tradition had historically not had access to, because it had always recruited from populations that were already shaped by the tradition's existing assumptions. The tattoos that marked members of the One Sith were a statement about belonging in a more literal and more permanent sense than the ranks and titles of earlier Sith traditions had been. Earlier ranks could be taken away or superseded or rendered meaningless by the death of the master who had assigned them. The marks of the one Sith were written on the body itself, a physical commitment to an identity that could not be simply revoked or traded in for another affiliation. For students at the academy, receiving the tattoos was the moment of transformation rather than a moment of institutional completion, the point at which they stopped being candidates, being assessed, and became members of something they were now part of in a way that extended beyond the institutional context that had created the membership. The relationship Crate's Academy cultivated with the physical and historical weight of Korriban was more deliberate than what earlier structures on the same site had typically managed. Crate understood what Korriban represented to the tradition, not just as a location with useful dark side energy and useful historical associations, but as a place that carried the accumulated record of everything the Sith had ever tried and everything the Sith had ever failed at. He designed the Academy's engagement with the tombs and the ruins and the ancient structures of the valley to make that record available to students, not as a list of achievements to be celebrated, but as a comprehensive case study in the recurring patterns of Sith self-destruction that the one Sith was being built specifically to break. The pattern, visible from the perspective of the valley's long history, was consistent enough to be disturbing. Institution after institution had been built on Korriban, and institution after institution had been destroyed, not primarily by external enemies, but by the internal dynamics that the Sith educational tradition had always built into its foundational assumptions. The 100-year darkness had ended in the exile of the Dark Jedi rather than their triumph. The Golden Age of Ragnos had ended in the succession crisis that its own structure made inevitable. The Great Hyperspace War had consumed everything the academies of that era had built. Exar Kun's school had burned with the moon it occupied. The Revan model had collapsed with the Sith Order Revan had built. Even Tria's Academy, the most philosophically original attempt the tradition had ever made to do something genuinely different, had been destroyed by the betrayal it had been designed to enable. And the Rule of Two, Bane's radical solution to the root problem, had produced a tradition of extraordinary depth and extraordinary fragility, simultaneously, a single thread that ran through 1,000 years of galactic history without ever breaking, and that still ended. At Endor, in the deaths of the only two people who carried it, what Crate was trying to build was something that could survive the catastrophes that had always eventually destroyed the institutions before it. Not by being stronger in the simple sense, though strength was part of what the one Sith offered, but by being structured in a way that did not build its own destruction into its foundational principles. A Sith tradition that taught its students to work together rather than to destroy each other was a tradition that had addressed what Crate believed was the original flaw. The flaw that all the academies and all the wars and all the brilliant masters and exceptional students across 4,000 years of institutional history had never managed to solve. Whether he was right is a question that subsequent history answered in ways complex enough to resist any simple summary. The One Sith's Academy produced practitioners of genuine capability and genuine commitment. It demonstrated that the traditional model of competitive internal violence was not the only possible way to organize dark side instruction. It proved that Sith could be taught to see each other as colleagues, and that the dark side's ambitions could be organized around shared external purposes when the educational framework producing the practitioners was designed with that outcome in mind. These were real achievements. They were genuinely new things. In the history of a tradition, that had been repeating versions of the same fundamental error for longer than the Republic had existed. And yet the circle the Academy stood in was the same circle every Sith Academy had stood in from the beginning. Because the knowledge being transmitted and the power being developed through that transmission was knowledge and power that reshaped everyone who genuinely learned it in ways that were very difficult to predict and very difficult to direct from outside. The dark side does not stay still in the hands of those who embrace it fully. It moves. It grows in directions the Master did not intend and the institution did not plan for. It takes people places they did not choose to go and makes them things they did not set out to become. And the history of Sith education, from the first moment Ajunta Pal looked at the red sands of Korriban and started thinking about what he could build there, to the last student who trained in Crate's Academy on the same ancient ground thousands of years later, is the history of institutions trying to manage what is not fully manageable, to direct what cannot be fully directed, to pass on a tradition that always carried within it the seeds of the transformation that would eventually take it somewhere its founders had not planned. This is what the Sith Academies always were. Beneath all the stone and the hierarchy and the carefully designed competition and the philosophical architecture built to justify what the institutions did to the people inside them, they were attempts by people who had chosen the dark side to hold on to something that the dark side itself made impossible to hold. The knowledge they taught was real. The power it produced was real. The tradition that ran from those first exiles landing on Korriban to the last generation receiving the marks of the one Sith was real and continuous, and produced individuals and moments and ideas that the galaxy is still working through the consequences of. But the darkness that made all of it possible also made it unstable, in the specific way that things built on fundamental tensions are always unstable, waiting for the tension to resolve in the one direction that the tradition had never wanted it to go. Every master who ever stood in front of a student and tried to teach the dark side discovered this eventually. The lesson always went somewhere they had not planned. The student always became something they had not entirely intended. And the Academy, whatever form it took on whatever world it occupied, in whatever era of the galaxy's long history, was always, in the end, less a place where the dark side was controlled, and more a place where the dark side was, working through the people inside it with the patient indifference of something that does not need institutions to survive and does not mourn the ones that fall.